Tell me about the Salvation Army case.
The Salvation Army case was, I think, the most publicized case I've ever had in terms of the number of newspaper articles. And for good reason that you'll come to understand. It was very salacious. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Client came to me. He had suffered a skull fracture from an assault. And normally, assaults don't often become civil cases for damages. Because usually the kind of people that go around beating people up don't have anything worth going after. And normally, of course, personal injury cases are about going after insurance money. But under California law, you cannot be insured for assault because assault, by its nature, is an intentional act. I am meaning to hit you, right? I'm meaning to hurt you. I'm meaning to hit you. And by California public policy, it is illegal to have insurance for any act that is intentional. In other words, you can only have insurance for things that are accidental, things that you don't intend, etc. Otherwise, of course, you could go out and buy insurance for beating someone up and then go beat someone up, right? Doesn't work. So it's pretty rare for an assault to actually go through the civil litigation process, and even rarer for a case that's rooted in assault to get to trial, which this case did. And when I first brought the case forward, a lot of people, including the defense lawyer, said, "Oh, what are you doing? You'll never win that case. You can't win that case." Because guess what? It was against the Salvation Army. You know, those nice folks that ring the bells at Christmas time outside the grocery store to get money for, the poor and everything else, right? Well, the case was against the Salvation Army, so let me tell you about it. It is fascinating. My client, I had 3 clients, but I consider one of my clients to be my primary client, and that's because he received the worst by far of the beating. Well, my client was on shore leave, Thanksgiving shore leave from the Navy. His Navy ship had just gotten back from doing humanitarian aid where they brought medical and food and clean water supplies to an Asian country stricken by a tsunami. And he came back to the Bay Area where he was from and was on Thanksgiving shore leave, got together with his friends. It was Thanksgiving week, and they decided to, go and just have a good time and walk around Santa Rosa and, go for dinner, have some drinks, etc. When my clients were walking through this Chevron gas station park, the gas station area, and this van pulled up and people piled out. They were surrounded by violent criminals, intent on beating them up for no better reason than the joy of beating people up. And they literally beat those 3 men. A couple of them managed to get away, but my, what I'll call primary client, ended up unconscious from being beaten on the pavement, and these violent criminals literally stomping on his head with their boots. And he ended up with a skull fracture that went from the top of his head down the side of his skull, internal fractures of the internal bones behind the nose. We had films of all these things. If I can find them, I'll share them with you, and you could put them on the screen, actually. And ended up, obviously, with a head injury like that, with with what's called a traumatic brain injury. He largely recovered in terms of his cognitive abilities, but he was left with a terrible post-traumatic stress disorder because of the randomness of the assault. He was left with a stress disorder where he could not be in public spaces around other people without terrible fear. He would go into a Walmart or a Target and then, hear people all of a sudden talking behind him and go into a complete panic because of what happened. There was no anticipation. This was an event that happened to him, a terrible assault that happened to him out of the blue. He didn't cause it. He didn't have interaction with the people before it happened. It just happened. And so that left him with a terrible feeling of being unsafe. When I had him on the witness stand talking about how he felt now, it was such compelling testimony because he talked about how he grew up in a neighborhood of North Philadelphia that was a very rough neighborhood. And that's where he grew up before coming out west. It was a very rough neighborhood, and he testified that he never felt scared. He considered himself a very strong person, very, I'd say brave, but bravery implies fear and doing something anyway, like having courage. But he wasn't. He was just not a fearful person. And now he lived in fear every day. And it was a struggle to have to think like, okay, if his wife asked him to go get groceries, he would become fearful of then having to go out in public because of this horrible assault. In any event, that's why I took this case on. This man's life was forever altered because of what had happened to him. And normally in an assault, whose fault is it?
Assaulter.
Yeah. And what are you going to do? Sue a bunch of violent felons for what? What are you going to get from them?
Shouldn't they just go to jail or something?
And they did. They did. They were caught, and they all went to jail. They all actually prison. But how does that provide any kind of compensation to help the young man get counseling, psychological help, etc.?
So I'm to presume you tried to sue Salvation Army because of the position it set the smart main guy in?
Yes. So it gets a lot, I'll call it worse. Better for the case, worse for just humanity, like what went on there. And so now I'm going to back up and tell you how they got to be there. There was a man who was charged with a crime, who was affiliated with dangerous prison gang, who the court decided to give an option to, which is not uncommon because it was a drug offense. Go to jail or go to the Lytton Springs Salvation Army Residential Rehab Center. Those are your two choices. Well, a lot of people, whether they're serious or not about rehab, will go to the rehab instead of going to jail or prison. So that's what he did. And he was a very intelligent young man in his 20s. And he was very good at manipulating people because he was very intelligent. He was very good at learning what people wanted to see and showing that to them. And in this case, the Lytton Springs Residential Salvation Army Rehab was run by I will call her the church lady. If you remember the old Saturday Night Live, you're probably too young, but my generation, the old Saturday Night Live, Dana Carvey, the famous comedian, played this character called the church lady, and she would just sit there and the organ music would be playing, and she'd be talking about Jesus and, chastising people for their fornication, things like that. And it was a funny character. Well, this lady was practically that. Very, very naive, even though she was running a residential rehab center where sometimes dangerous, violent felons would come to avoid jail. And they would have them in their mandatory come into the chapel and sing church hymns. And the saying, as I learned, amongst the, we'll call them inmates, clients, whatever you want to call them, the people that were there to avoid jail, was fake it till you make it. They would just sing about Jesus and keep the Salvation Army manager person happy, and then that person would sign off that they did their rehab and they'd be free to go back on the street. Well, the gentleman that I started this story about, he went to the residential rehab facility as part of an alternative to going to jail. And he did great, got along with everyone real well, didn't cause any problems. And this facility had a history of having a lot of turnover in terms of their management. And it just so happened that while he was completing his 6 months of residential live-in rehab, the assistant resident manager quit. And they needed a new assistant resident manager. So church lady decided, and by the way, this is no slant on church people. I love lots of church people, but this lady was the epitome of a naive, do good without observation of what's happening around you, church lady. And so she decided what a great idea it would be to hire this young man, we'll call him John, to hire John to be the assistant resident manager. But wait, you say, didn't he just finish the rehab himself? Yes, he had literally completed the 6 months of rehab, and they hired him as the assistant manager of the rehab. And so within a month or two of him now working as the assistant resident manager there, the manager quit. And church lady thought, well, John is just such a lovely young man. Let's just hire him to run the whole thing. He'll just run the whole thing. He's such a good boy. So she hired John now as the live-in resident manager of the Lytton Springs Salvation Army residential rehab, which a good portion of the clients are simply there to avoid jail, some of which are affiliated with gangs, many of which are prior felons, etc. And so now you've got John running the whole show. What I learned, taking the longest deposition in my entire career, I took John's deposition for 3 days. Normally, I don't know if I've ever taken a deposition longer than a day. But with John, I needed to get all the information about what was going on there. John is now the manager of the rehab facility. And what I learned was that while he was the assistant manager and manager now in charge of the facility, he had virtually no supervision. And let me tell you some of the things he admitted to doing when I took his deposition under oath and cross-examined him. He admitted to, if he liked you and you were there, on a jail referral, alternative to going to jail, and you were still doing drugs, they had pee tests, urine tests. And if you failed, because he was administering them, If you failed one but he liked you, he'd swap some clean urine for your dirty urine and make sure you passed, even though you were still doing drugs and everything else. And if he didn't like you, even if you were clean, he'd swap the dirty urine and fail you back and send you to jail. That was just one of the things. He got what could have been the first clue to the church lady who was in charge of this facility. He got in a car accident when he was out getting donuts so that everyone could have donuts after their Sunday church service. Well, while he was out getting donuts, what had happened was he brought one of the new inmates out with him to go pick up the donuts, and there was one of those computer dust solution, one of those computer duster, like keyboard duster spray things rattling around in the passenger side, around their feet. He's like, "What is that?" "Oh, it's that, computer dust stuff." He's like, "Hey, give that to me." Grabbed it. Crashes the Salvation Army vehicle because he was huffing computer dust stuff. And they conducted no investigation about why he just crashed the Salvation Army vehicle. Nothing. What else did he do while he was there? He would load up the van like the night in question, but on occasions prior to the night in question, he would load up the van with various affiliates of criminal organizations that, gang members that happened to be there, and he would drive them out into Santa Rosa. He'd drive down Santa Rosa Avenue and pick up street prostitutes and bring them back to the Salvation Army residential rehab for drinking and other things that people do with prostitutes. He would do all these things. Oh, he also had liquor in his room. This was a funny one. He had liquor in his room, which was, of course, forbidden. And he would go to work as the manager of the rehab facility in the morning. People would be like, "Whoa, you reek of alcohol, dude." He'd be drunk in the morning. And on one such occasion, someone reported to Church Lady that he was drunk in the morning. And she instituted a search of his room. And when she searched his room, she found the alcohol, but she got very distracted because what she also found were some Playboy magazines. And Playboy magazines are absolutely restricted and forbidden. So is alcohol. But she ignored the fact that there was alcohol in the room and got all focused on the fact that there were some booby magazines in his residential manager suite, and didn't bother conducting anything further about the fact that this is a rehab facility and he's got liquor in his room. In any event, on the night in question, he was off duty. He wasn't currently on duty. And he grabbed the keys to the Salvation Army van, said, "Hey guys, let's go out on the town, let's tie one on." And so these violent criminals pile into the van. He takes them down to the bar on Mendocino Avenue. They call it the Dirty Bird. And they literally beat up the bouncers of the bar and closed it down just because they wanted to beat people up. And it was after they were all amped up from beating up the bouncers at the Dirty Bird, which is already, I don't frequent that bar I don't know if it's still open. I think it still is, but it's, you know, it's a bar where you would expect the bouncers to be able to hold their own, but against these guys, no. The bouncers got beat up. So then this van full of folks, still amped up, wanted to beat up more people. And that's when they saw my client who's on Thanksgiving shore leave from the Navy, walking down the street with his two friends, walking through the Chevron parking lot, and decided, hey, let's beat up these guys. And so that's when they pulled up the van, piled out, and beat my clients, and particularly badly beat my one client, fracturing his skull. Then they piled back in the van and drove back to the Salvation Army, and fortunately someone had gotten the license plate of the van and reported it, and they discovered it was a Salvation Army van, and the perpetrators were arrested. And it became my job to prove why this was not just a bunch of criminals' fault, it was the Salvation Army's fault for allowing this to happen, for putting all of the things in motion for this to happen. And the defense lawyers, very, very good lawyers, Steve Worth and Mark Hazelwood, tremendous defense lawyers. Salvation Army, you know, they're not a poor organization. They are a very large organization with a lot of money, and they hired very, very competent defense lawyers who, you know, took the position, as you would expect, that, hey, no jury is going to blame the Salvation Army for the acts of these criminals. You're not going to get anything from us. And I said, I don't see it that way. This would not have happened if the Salvation Army had acted with any kind of proper care. This man, John, would not have been in a position to have the keys to the Salvation Army, to be in a position to, you know, do whatever he wants with these known violent criminals and take them into town, et cetera, et cetera. And the defense lawyers argued, of course, well, he wasn't even on duty that night, so you can't even get the Salvation Army on a, you know, what's called course and scope. If you're acting in the course and scope of your employment, then the employer can be held liable. But they said, well, he was off duty that night. And I said, no way. He may not have been quote unquote on the clock being paid by the hour at those particular hours, but he was the residential live-in manager of this facility, which means he's really never off duty. And if he takes the keys to the Salvation Army van and invites a bunch of the people that he's in charge of because he's the resident manager, then I don't care what the work schedule says, he's on duty. He is acting as if he's in charge of these people. He's acting as an agent of the Salvation Army with those keys and doing what he's doing. And we went all the way through trial in this case. It was, at the beginning of trial, the Salvation Army offered us $100,000. At that point, we had already had $70,000 in costs in the case. Out of my pocket costs for all the court reporter fees, for depositions, exhibits, for experts. I hired a very, very good neuropsychologist named Dr. Rick Olchese, who has become my friend since, because he's been my expert in a number of cases involving traumatic brain injury. And he conducted testing on my client to determine the areas of his brain injury and what its effect was going to have cognitively, in addition to the post-traumatic stress and post-concussive headache issues that he had. The long story short, by the time they offered $100,000, I had already spent $70,000 of my own money on the case. And so what that means is if I take my fee, which is typically, by the time of trial, 40%, and I take the cost back, it would have left my client nothing. So it was easy to say no. And that's something actually that has come up in a number of cases where the defense doesn't offer enough to make you have to have a hard decision. If the defense in that case had offered me 300,000 instead of 100,000, I would have had to really think about it, because I would have had to tell my client, who didn't have a lot of money, okay, after my fees and costs, you'll still put, maybe close to $100,000 in your pocket, something like that. Yeah, maybe a little more than $100,000 in your pocket, and that would have been a lot of money to him. He was a Navy guy. He didn't have a lot of money, and he needed money to help him get through these issues with his PTSD and everything else. So if they had offered that, we would have been potentially hard pressed to say no, because we were up against the Salvation Army. It is an uphill battle to sue a charitable organization like that people love.
Could you factor in the costs, the added costs of having like a delivery person deliver this stuff?
Sure. At that time, it didn't really exist. There was no DoorDash. This case was 2010. I don't think DoorDash existed, or Grubhub or Uber Eats. But yeah, that's a good point. Anytime you can prove that you have an injury and there's a way to ameliorate, to lessen the burden of that injury, but that has a cost, you can certainly claim that. And it's, of course, up to the jury to decide whether that is a reasonable cost or a reasonable service for that person or not. But absolutely, that could have been something we could have claimed. Now, I will say, though, that you don't want the jury anchoring on small numbers. So if you say, okay, it'll cost, over the course of the next 20 years, his DoorDash fees might be, call it something big, $25,000, over the next 20 years. You don't want the jury fixating on small numbers. So you don't want the jury going into the deliberation room saying, okay, well, his life will be better for $25,000. So, okay, we'll give him that. And then how much, and then how much else should we give him? Okay, maybe another 100 on, it's called anchoring. You don't want the jury even contemplating or talking about small numbers if you're going to ask for a big number. So that's also something to be considered when you are presenting numbers. It's not always a good idea to claim everything. So where was I?
What was the big claim in this case?
Oh, well, in this case, it was primarily the effect on his life, in terms of his, what you would call the enjoyment of life. If you are terrified going into Target or Walgreens because, at every sound you're going to jump because you're thinking someone might be jumping you from behind and beat you, that is going to affect your day-to-day experience with life and what's called the enjoyment of life. And so that was primarily the category of damages. We had a category also for psychological help. You get the recommendation. I can't remember exactly how many sessions were recommended to him, ongoing. He had psychological help up until the time of trial, but they were still recommending a continued course and a maintenance schedule to help him. And so certainly those costs were part of it. But primarily, we call it pain and suffering. And that doesn't just mean physical pain because you hurt your arm, but, suffering in life, not being able to enjoy life like you did, being scared when you never used to be scared, a loss of self. He was no longer the person that he was before that incident. Like he said, he always considered himself not a fearful person before that. And now, and at that point, it was expected that He would likely be a fearful person for the rest of his life, at least to some degree. Counseling, was hopefully going to help him further, but this kind of trauma, is difficult to erase. So those are all under the basket of what are called general damages, things that you can't easily write down on a chalkboard, like lost wages and medical expenses. So they didn't make it hard enough for us to make a decision not to go to trial. So it became I won't say no risk, because of course I was risking the $100,000 they offered. I could have convinced my client maybe that I would split it with them and I'd get my 50 grand back and give him 50 grand or something like that, but he had been through so much, and we had invested so much time, heart, energy into the case that we had to do our best for him. And so we went through trial, and the trial, there were 3 newspaper articles in the Press Democrat over the course of the trial, 2 during the trial and 1 after the verdict, because of the facts were just so unbelievable. It's unbelievable that at the Salvation Army rehab, you've got hookers having drunken parties at the Salvation Army rehab. Like, that's newsworthy. People like to read about that kind of stuff. They're like, what? And it was a pitched battle in the courtroom. And in the end, I walked the jury through the claims, which are negligent supervision and negligent hiring. I basically took the legal position that the Salvation Army is responsible because they never should have hired John to be in charge. And after they hired him, so that's one layer of negligence. And if they never should have hired him, this wouldn't have happened. And then the second bite at the apple was negligent supervision. If you're going to hire someone like John, who literally just finished the rehab program himself in order to avoid jail, then how about a modicum of supervision? How about watch what he's doing? How about, just some kind of oversight?
After the fallout of this, did Church Lady get fired?
I don't think so. So I walked the jury through, in closing argument, all of the facts, and we had a lot. And we had a lot of good facts about why they shouldn't have hired him. And by the way, John, before trial, he had recently got out of prison. He went to prison for this. And he recently had got out before the trial. And we were able, like I said, to take his deposition over the course of 3 days and learn all of these facts.
How long was he in prison for?
I think he was in prison for a couple years.
That's it?
Yeah. I know one of the people that was involved in the beating, this was his 3rd strike, under California, 3 strike felonies, and you have a life in prison case.
This is baseball?
Yeah. So it was his 3rd strike, and so he ended up with a life sentence as a result of the assault. But John ended up in prison for a couple of years and got out. And to his credit, really was, I think, on his way to turning his life around. And I do not say that lightly. But he was a very intelligent young man. He literally read philosophy books. I took his deposition over the course of 3 days. I can tell the difference between a moron and a smart person. He was a smart person whose life just went down a wrong and dangerous path. And I remember actually asking him why he thinks that happened, because he was obviously a smart person.
Did you ask them for the case or because you wanted to know?
Good question. Over the course of 3 days, you ask literally hundreds and hundreds of questions, and one question can just lead to another. And I don't remember whether I had in mind just my own personal curiosity or whether it was specifically for the case. But I did want to know how a smart person who is a voracious reader and clearly intelligent and clearly capable, like he would be capable of making something of his life, why he ended up on this path, on this down the wrong path. And I remember what he told me. He told me that when he was a boy, a really young man, he grew up in a poor household, and he would have to take the bus. And the bus would also be taken by scary people, people that would look and act violent, potential gang type people, rough people. And he was very scared of them. And he told me that he was so scared of the monsters that he decided that the way to not be scared was to become a monster. And I'll never really forget that, because, you know, it kind of gave me a little bit of sympathy for him in the direction that his life took. And I really, really hope that he has done better, because he certainly has the capacity for it. But to his credit, he cooperated. He cooperated with giving full and honest answers. He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to tell me what was really going on there at the Salvation Army. If he wasn't as honest as he was, I wouldn't have had the case that I had. And even on the witness stand, do you think he enjoyed being up on that witness stand, talking about the things that he did? And, you know, he felt terrible.
Did he though?
Yes, absolutely. He had genuine remorse. He asked if he could apologize to my clients. And in an effort to, I was of course, for my client, always needed to be a little bit skeptical, like what's his motivation? Because I know he's smart. I know he's a manipulator, can be a manipulator, right? So I was worried, like, oh, does he want to apologize in front of the jury? Because he said, I want to, you know, when I go up on the stand tomorrow, I'd like to offer your clients an apology in public for what happened. And I was worried, like, oh, what's this going to do to the jury and their opinion of everything that happened, and, you know, things like that. So I went to the judge. I said, Judge, you know, may I have a sidebar? And we went up, and I said, I don't mind if he apologizes. Maybe it would be good for my client, you know, to get some closure, because he's so fearful now in life. But I don't think he should be permitted to do it in front of the jury in the middle of this case. And so the judge said, I agree, I won't allow him to apologize in front of the jury. So the judge actually said, you're not allowed to apologize in front of the jury. You can do it after. You know, we'll excuse the jury once your questioning is finished. We'll excuse the jury from the courtroom, and you can say, you know, whatever you want to say, which was the right decision by the judge. And so that's what happened. And I remember him being tearful and very genuinely remorseful. You know, he could have said, oh, well, if I'm not going to do it in front of the jury, then forget it, right? No, it was genuine. He wanted to turn his life around, and he was smart enough to do it. And I hope right now he's doing something good with his life. But the challenge still came. No matter how much I talked to that jury about everything that happened at the Salvation Army, with them hiring this person who was obviously highly, highly improper for so many reasons to be in charge of rehab. I mean, he was literally in charge of people that he was in rehab with, because there were people that were in the rehab that started like halfway when he was in there. And then he was out and then in charge of those same buddies that he was palling around with while he was an inmate, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, totally inappropriate. And then the lack of supervision, him crashing the car, the liquor in his room, being able to bring hookers back and partying like right under the nose of the Salvation Army with no repercussions. Him having access to be able to just grab the keys whenever he wants and bring violent felons, wherever he wants and get them drunk on the town. Like, these are people in rehab. Like, that's crazy. But in spite of all that, the defense still had a very strong argument. When criminal acts occur, you blame the criminal. And there are jury instructions that talk about what is called, superseding cause. So superseding cause is legal jargon for basically something that interrupts the connection between, it's like A and then B and then C. B is like the superseding cause of C. So you can't go back to A. And I know it's a little complicated, but the point on it is, okay, yes, the Salvation Army, could have hired someone better and all that stuff. But the fact that criminals committed intentionally criminal acts, you can't blame an organization for the fact that criminals committed intentionally criminal acts. And that's a very strong argument. And people have very generally, even non-religious people, have warm feelings towards the Salvation Army. So, I did my walk through the evidence thing, and then the Salvation Army's defense lawyers get up, and they were very good and very kind and very sympathetic because, of course, they couldn't attack my clients, right? My clients were victims, and they said my clients were victims. They were victims of the criminals. And they got up and they talked about how, it's not right to blame anyone but criminals for crime. And I knew that was what their argument was going to be. So in preparing for the end of this trial, I wanted to come up with something that where I could reach the jury and teach them and show them why. Why was the Salvation Army? Why should they find that the Salvation Army is responsible more than the criminals are responsible? And I remember in the days leading up to trial, knowing what the defense was going to do at the end, no matter what I did, and thinking, how can I reach the jury? And I like generally in closing arguments are split between, the plaintiff, that's my side, we start, and then the defense gives their closing, and then I get the last word as the plaintiff. It's like a reply to what the defense said. And I always like to walk through the evidence more formally in my initial closing, and then the defense goes and they talk about the evidence and the law, and then I like to leave the jury with something a little more from the heart. And so after the defense sat down, I got up and I responded to some of the formal evidence pieces, but then I said, ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you a story. And it's a story of a zoo. And this zoo is a very special zoo because it specializes in dangerous animals. There's no ducks and nice, antelope at this zoo. This zoo has tigers and alligators and vipers, poisonous things with teeth and claws. And one day, a wolf comes to the zoo. And the zookeeper is really impressed with this wolf. The wolf doesn't cause any problems with the other wolves, doesn't cause any problems with the lions or the alligators. The wolf lines up for its food on time. The wolf goes to sleep. The wolf is well behaved. And one day, the zookeeper decides, this wolf is so well behaved, I'm giving the wolf the keys to the zoo. And then the zookeeper goes to sleep. And while the zookeeper's asleep, the wolf takes those keys and he unlocks the cages of the tiger, the alligators, the vipers, the lions, and all the animals, the dangerous animals of this zoo, run through town and they hurt people. And they don't hurt people because they're hungry, because they were well fed. They hurt people because they like to hurt people. So who do you blame for that, ladies and gentlemen? Do you blame the wolf? The wolf is just being a wolf. You blame the zookeeper because it is the zookeeper that knows better. And I left them with that story. And I like to think that that reached them. Because the zookeeper, of course, is the Salvation Army, and they should have known better than to give the keys to the wolf. And of course, there was a lot of great analogies there because he took the keys to the car and he brought the dangerous animals to the town and they hurt people. So the last heading, the front page above the fold, which means the top of the newspaper, Press Democrat, was $1 million verdict against the Salvation Army. So it was pretty big news, especially after 2 other articles about what had happened in the case. And we got justice for my client, and we were able to give them the money so that he and his wife could buy a little home. They bought a little home in a small town. I want to say Oklahoma, I believe, because he didn't want to be around crowds anymore. He could not stand being anywhere near a city. So he bought a little home in a small town, and we helped him do that. And I remember reaching out to him a couple years later, and he said he was still struggling, but doing a little better. So anyway, that's the story of the Salvation Army case. And I do admit that in the years past that have gone past, at Christmas time, I smile just a little bit to myself when I see the Salvation Army bell ringers. Yes, they're doing good work, but I hope now that they're doing better.